So here's the big one. Let's talk vintage. All right, guys. So this one's a little touchy for me. I have a sense of imposter syndrome on this one, just because of how many people have come before me to talk about vintage cards or vintage collections. It's something I've always loved, but I was born in the 80s. I missed it. I missed the collecting, the opening the packs of it. I was ripping during the junk wax era. So I feel like an imposter coming to talk about vintage cards. But man, I consume a lot of content on vintage, and I collect vintage. I love it. I'm a baseball fan, not just a collector of the sport, fan of the sport. It's just something I enjoy, and I love getting wisdom from people who specialize in vintage cards, not just because of the values and what to get, but also because of the history of the game, what these players did, the differences between then and now. And it's pretty special. And I don't know, this kind of sounds like a condescending way to put it, but I promise I don't mean it this way. It almost seems like the natural progression of collecting is that the first instinct is to collect what generation you grew up in, the packs you opened when you were a kid. And then you kind of move into, all right, well, I still watch the sports today. I have favorite players that are playing right now, so I'll collect them as well. And then you discover this is a short-term flipping mess, and people are losing their minds over hype cycles and what players are hot this week. They're trying to collect cards for 48 hours just to turn around and try to flip them as fast as they can. And these are people who are not committed as a career to business. Like, Ty from Chasing Cardboard, that's what he does for a living. He buys collections. His goal is to get them out, as fast as he can onto the next collection. And along the way, they find some personal collection items as well. That's not the goal of most of these people. Most of the time, it's just the hype hits. They have a fear of missing out on what's going on, and they jump, both feet first into it. And then they settle into that for a while, kind of becomes a mixture of everything. And then it's like they hear this sound in the back of their brain. It's like vintage. And I joke, but I swear it's true. It's like the more you mature into the hobby, the more you're into vintage. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of people to back me up on that one. And I promise I do not mean it in a condescending way, as if you're not a collector if you don't collect vintage or whatever. It's just a different style of collecting, but it seems like for those of us with a massive love of the game and the hobby, it almost comes natural. You can't fight it. It's, how can you love hitting and not love Ted Williams or Pete Rose? How can you not love what catchers do without watching, bench? I mean, it just comes with the territory, right? And I want to address a few questions that I got, or some comments on YouTube on the last video. And it said that Mike from Chasing Cardboard sent me. I'm not sure what that means. I'm kind of new to the YouTube community again. I've been posting mostly on TikTok for the past, little while. And but if that's the case, appreciate it, Mike, for sending people my way. They're collecting vintage on the other end of the spectrum. Let me put this into context first. If you haven't watched the previous video, you may pause now, go back and watch that one. It's about grading and investing long-term, what we can expect to have the huge upside later on for PSA 8s and 9s and even some 7s. But what I didn't specify in the video was that I was specifically talking about kind of the mid-80s to modern. That applies very heavily to that time period. Vintage is a whole different animal. Some of the same logic still applies, but not the number grades themselves. So let me just clarify that. So, this guy's, and I'll shout him out, it's Back to the Cardboard. Appreciate you subscribing. he's collecting ones, twos, and sometimes threes. And he's saying that, sometimes he can get them cheaper than raw. And then Baseball Card Fanatic, also said Mike sent him, so I appreciate it. Said theory makes sense for 80s to present. He's absolutely correct. I should have did a better job of explaining that. Do you have any theories on particular grades in vintage that may be worth targeting? And I absolutely do. I kind of teased in the comment. Excuse me. But I absolutely have a theory. I'm going to call it a hypothesis. I have a big stigma about using the word theory because it's overused in a lot of places. However, my theory is very similar to what I looked at versus what I looked at with junk wax era on to current with PSA 7s, 8s, and 9s. Except it's on the flip side. Now you're looking at authentic, which is the lowest grade. A lot of times it's just saying, hey, this is an authentic card. It's a real version of this card, but it's not worth putting a grade on. And you have your ones, twos, and threes. And then you really start to step up into different categories. Once you get past that, especially in Hall of Famers, it starts to become expensive. And I brought a few examples. So I picked this one up in Pigeon Forge, maybe? No, West Virginia. But anyway, this is a Johnny Bench PSA 2. Beautiful card. The colors are awesome. Great condition card. The Rookie Cup is my favorite. Second year card. I've always loved the Future Stars and the Rookie Cups. PSA 2 of this card bounces somewhere between $60 to $80, depending on where you find it, what kind of deal you can get on it if you're buying multiple cards at once. That is a massive investment because Johnny is an all-time great. He's also happens to be one of my top 5 favorite players of all time. And over time, these are going to become more scarce. That seems pretty logical to say, but I think it's actually, people know that that's the case, but it doesn't necessarily click. These cards, especially in certain conditions, will get torn up over time. And a lot of this, what happens is, and Mike from Chasing Cardboard, he knows this. He goes around the country with Ty chasing these collections, and they find them in some of the places that you really don't want to find card collections. They got no sleeves, no top loaders. They're thrown in shoe boxes. They're in a barn or building outside. You have moisture. You have, the rats, just a ton of things can happen to these cards. And even though they had great intentions on storing them and keeping them for later, over time it just gets worse and worse and worse. Not to mention the paper these things were made with are delicate. Mishandling one of these and something goes wrong and you've just about ruined it, right? So you have to be very careful. And by very careful, I mean from a long-term investing standpoint, for the average collector, I'm not talking about people that can throw down on some, massive graded cards. If a Johnny Bench PSA 8, 9, or 10, if you got that kind of money, you're not looking at my advice on YouTube anyway. These lower grades, the 3s, the 2s, the 1s, you can find some 3s and 2s for pretty reasonable prices, and you can look at the charts and see that it's pretty consistent over time. Where I think you're going to find the most value, and this is kind of an answer to this question, I think buying 3s, 2s, and 1s in vintage is a very wise move. And I think over time the upside is huge. I think authentic and 1, and not specifically PSA, because I do love vintage and SGC. Those are going to be your big target investments. And let me explain why. I think this kind of summarizes the point that I want to make with average collectors who are buying average grades, who still want to make an investment or still have a collection that is worth something, but at the same time they're not breaking the bank. They can only afford to buy, I buy like one of these a month because I have a budget and I have bills and I can't pay for, crazy price cards all the time. Excuse me. The cost of grading is a huge expense that is talked about all of the time. but I don't know that it's considered in the proper context when it comes to investing. So, you say, oh, well, this price went from, I'll use GameStop, for example, because for a common collector, that's an easy way to get in. You may not necessarily have the money to throw down 20 cards at once or buy a PSA membership or whatever the case may be. And all of a sudden, you're grading one card, maybe two cards at a time. Prices just went up $2 a card with GameStop, and they added shipping costs. What used to be worth sending in to get graded isn't anymore. And when you start to price yourself out of certain tiers of cards, for example, an average player from the 60s, let's say you have a card, you're not sure what it's going to get. It really doesn't start getting value until a 6 or a 7 because it's just an average player. And you think, well, I can send this in, and even if I have to sell it later on, I may get 10%, return on my investment on this card. Or when my family sells it later on, let's say, Mike and Ty show up to your house one day and they're buying your collection, and they say, hey, we can only give you so many percent because they got to make money. You want to make sure that you have as much margin as you possibly can because they want to make money and you want to make a return on your investment, right? Or your family, at least, when you pass. When somebody like that shows up, they want to be able to make as much as possible to pay for expenses and bills and pay off the house, whatever. As grading expenses rise, now you're looking at, let's just call it, let's make it an even number, something simple, but it's actually more than this. $25 a card to grade. On a lot of examples of cards, you can find very good quality raw and low graded PSA and SGC 1, 2s, and 3s for way less than raw price. Let's just do an experiment here. I set this one here, but it may qualify. I did not pay this, by the way. So that's I believe, a Magic second year. I just picked this up when I got my manual, if you watched the previous video. This card is marked at $80. I absolutely did not pay $80, so don't sweat that. I think it was closer to like 20 or 25, something like that. So that card, let's pretend all of a sudden that we're going to send that card in for grading, right? So I'm going to go to eBay. We're going to check last sold net listings on this card. I forget the number on it. 21. So Magic Johnson, 21. This isn't as vintage as we're talking about, but the principle is still the same, so bear with me. So we're going to call this a PSA 6. And we're going to filter by sold items. Okay. So here we go. Sold May 15th, $23.51. You've had a couple. There's one at $22 for a PSA 6. There's $39.99. So you're looking at an average somewhere in between the high 20s to $30. We'll just call it $30. So this card I buy raw because they want to charge raw price for that card. For $3 more, I can buy a PSA 6. Which is still a great quality card. Their grading so strict now. PSA 6 is a very nice card for a collection. The cost of grading, if I were to send this in, now I have a $25 card plus $25 in grading fees for $50 in a gamble that it might get better than a 6. Even if it does, it's incremental. And vintage cards, it's a little more extreme. The price differences between 2, 3, 4, whatever, it starts to exponentially go up, right? However, the cost of grading for those authentic cards and 1s and 2s is still high because these people hope that they're going to get a higher grade. They want to put it in a slab. You buy these 1s and 2s for $20, you're paying less than the cost to have the card graded for the card in the slab. Eventually, that's not going to be the case. You're not going to be able to get an auction and say, I paid $8 for a, random guy's PSA 1 who's a 1950s ball player. That's just not going to happen, because you're not going to pay the grading fee to buy the raw card to send it off because the value's not there. So buying already graded 1s, 2s, 3s, and even authentics is going to be, percentage-wise, a much larger investment for average collectors than trying to save up and buy a PSA 10. The prices on those, once you start hitting the multiplier, once you get to that 7, 8, 9 in vintage, and you're well past what normal collectors can buy, you may pay, $1.5 million for a card, and then 2 months later, it's worth 1.2. Or somebody goes to Heritage Auctions and gets one for $1 million. And the risk factor is so great that it makes it a little wiser of a decision to actually go into the lower grades to purchase those for long-term investing, because even if one player has a bad day, let's say that, I don't ever think this is going to happen. Let me be very, very clear. Let's say Johnny Bench runs over somebody with his car, a kid or something, and all of a sudden he's on the news, negative publicity. I think it'd go up anyway, but point being, let's say something happens and he goes down. A PSA 10 copy of that car is going to ruin me, right? PSA 2s, it's not going to hurt me as bad. My investment is more protected in that way, because my eggs are not all in one basket. I've got a lot of eggs in PSA 2s and 3s. So my theory is based on the price of grading is going to continue to go up as PSA realizes, and you guys saw this recently. If you haven't, let me let you know. PSA is getting ready to start offering services, or we think they're going to start offering services for cleaning, for subgrades or graders notes, and a few other things they're going to add on. Basically, $2 a card to clean it, which is, if you know the situation with the cleaning kits, is laughable at best. It's going to start costing a fortune. And that's for everyday guys trying to get cards graded, right? It makes it very, very difficult for the average collector to enter the market. So as much as we try to get new collectors in and say, hey, or even let's say we're trying to get them to start going into vintage. And they go and they're trying to find collections, and they're sending these things off to grade. They're not sending them in bulk. This is not their full-time profession. This is a hobby for most people. They're not sending in bulk submissions all the time. So the price of grading, as we continue to move throughout the calendar year, by the time we get to the end of 2026, PSA is probably going to be charging a $40 card. Over time, for the next 20 to 30 years, that the cost to grade a new PSA 2 Johnny Bench is going to cost the raw card value, which scarcity makes it go up, plus the additional charges that it's going to cost to grade the card 20 years from now. Comps then are going to be reflective of the cost of the card plus the raw value. Most of the time with these lower grades, people are so obsessed with chasing the high-grade 10s, they don't even pay attention to the 1s and 2s and authentics. That's where the opportunity comes in. If something happens, let's say PSA, for example, they're in population control mode. They're not gemming as many cards. They're extending out how long it takes to get a card back from grading, which means you could actually flip 30 different cards at a cheaper profit than you could if you waited 90 days, 60 days, whatever it is now. I say this all the time, just coming from a business background. I'm in construction now, ironically. I would much rather sell somebody or sell 20 items for $2 profit than 5 items for $5 profit. Gouging your customers and reducing the demand for the product or the service is not a wise move, especially when you have the market cornered. You think it'd be the opposite. It's not. PSA knows they have a huge market share and they can afford to lose business. What that means is other companies are going to start trying to move in where PSA is messing up. SGC's kind of been, from what I've heard, I haven't submitted any to SGC. I think they're delaying just a little bit longer than they used to, but not so much compared to like PSA and those companies. There's a lot of grading companies. I won't go into that today. However, the cost, most people, they like SGC for vintage cards. it makes more sense to use their services at a faster rate if you're trying to flip them, which I encourage long-term investing, not card flipping or short-term, unless you're going to do it gung-ho full-time and be awesome at it. I highly suggest buying these cards in the lower grades for long-term investment. If you try to buy them for short-term investment, short-term flipping or profits, it will bite you in the tail. It absolutely will, because you can't factor in the cost of grading changes then. Once you get 20 years down the road and it's $40 a card now, and your $15 profit that you made because of the cost difference in grading, if it compensates, you're at least going to get a percentage of that investment back through the difference in the cost of grading services. And that, like I said, that only applies to the lower end cards. And when you start getting into the, as I said, the bigger ones, the higher grades, it's a show. You're going to have to watch somebody else for that one, because I don't have any experience being able to buy a high grade vintage. That is an insane amount of money to spend. So I'll refer back to Mike on that one, that he's more of the professional on that one. I'm talking about average collector, everyday guy that can spend $60 a week on a graded card for his collection. Find a Johnny Bench Gold Cup PSA 2 and be happy with it for the next 20 to 30 years. That is my advice. I'm sure I'm missing some kind of facet to discuss, but I think the logic's pretty clear. The point is that we're trying to look long term. I'm not going to give short term advice, because I can't predict hype cycles. I can't predict, a vintage player, like when they're going to pass away, when their son's going to make it to the Hall of Fame, and now all of a sudden they're in the news again. There's just too many factors that I can't predict. What I can predict is people are consistent. Consumer behavior is something I studied in school, and I was actually very, very good at it. That what they had us do was try to predict, our friends, people that we knew, or even strangers, what they were going to purchase that day. And you studied them to figure out what they were going to do, what they were going to buy. And then as a marketer, you're trying to figure out how to market to those people to kind of steer them in a certain direction, almost like a mouse in a maze. You're trying to make sure you guide them through there. So along those lines, people being predictable, perceived scarcity is both a blessing and a nightmare for profit. If you're a collector, perceived scarcity in long-term investing is dangerous, because we don't know what it's based on. It's based on hype or the news cycle or whoever makes the headlines that day. There's too much going on there. A safe investment, it takes up more space because it's lower grades. You got to buy more of them. I think it's a wise move, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. It's a long answer to the questions on the comments, but I wanted to try to to address them. I think it's going to take a while. So don't get me wrong. I don't think this is something that's going to turn around and 2 years from now you're going to be like, he's a genius, and very well something could happen, because the hobby evolves over time, just like it did from when I was in the junk wax era. It's completely different now. The shows are different. The events are different. Collectors' tables are different. There's a lot of things that can evolve and grow. But safe investing is safe investing. And even if you buy that card and I am wrong, you're only out $20. If you're wrong on a PSA 10, somebody's going to be depressed, right? So just something to consider. I'd love to hear your comments or keep the discussion going. If you think of anything that you want to bring up again, I'd be happy to put some content out. But until then, I appreciate the networking, by the way. On TikTok, I've really been missing out on YouTube, apparently. I've had more, I wouldn't say more, I've had more frequency of big questions and things to actually discuss and talk about on YouTube thus far than I have on TikTok. I don't know if it's just because of the audience. The breaker culture on TikTok kind of makes it, who's this guy, what's he saying, and I put different kind of content on there. But it's been fun so far, just checking out the comments and you do a search for sports cards and, you get Jeff Wilson, Sports Card Investor, a few other channels, and there's nothing wrong with those people. I enjoy their content as well. But I don't get to actually reach out and get to people who have like 800 subscribers, right? And then have some awesome content they're putting out that just YouTube's be like, nah, I'm not gonna I'm not gonna push that out. So the more comments I get for those, I'll try to follow, the kind of stuff that interests me and support you guys as well. So thanks again for the comments. Before I forget, because I always do, if you guys wouldn't mind to, is it follow? Yeah, follow. Yeah, YouTube's follow, right? Yeah, follow, like the page, or subscribe, sorry. Wrong one. And leave a comment. I would really appreciate it. I really enjoy those. I share a lot of them with my wife because I get a kick out of some of the comments. So it's not something I'm trying to get in the algorithm. I realize this is going to be a slow growth type scenario. So when I say that I enjoy reading them and going through them, I really do. So hope you guys are having a good evening. Any more questions, and I'll put some more stuff out. We'll catch you on the next one. See you guys.